Bueno, perfecto. Pues voy a hacer una brevísima presentación. Ya os imagináis, yo vengo de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad Complutense. Ya sabéis que en la Facultad de Derecho somos así como un poco más formales y aunque yo soy de los informales de mi facultad, pues digamos que algo se me ha pegado, ¿no? Yo quiero agradecer al Grupo de Investigación Complutense sobre el Magreb y Oriente Medio y al Instituto Complutense de Estudios Internacionales, así como a esta muy rica, vibrante Facultad de Ciencias, Políticas y Sociología por haberme invitado a presentar este acto hoy. Esta sesión se titula Las Naciones Unidas y la cuestión de Palestina y está evidentemente a cargo del profesor Ardi Imseis de la Facultad de Derecho de Queens, en Canadá. Realmente la decana Esther del Campo ya ha hecho una presentación de nuestro ponente, pero debo decir que, como jurista, el profesor Imseis reúne dos raras características muy relevantes. Es, por una parte, académico y, por otro lado, es profesional del derecho. Así, además de ser un distinguido profesor de Derecho en su facultad, pues ha sido, como ha dicho también Isaías, pues funcionario durante más de una década de la Agencia de las Naciones Unidas para los Refugiados de Palestina en Oriente Próximo, miembro de la Comisión de Investigación de la ONU sobre Yemen entre 2019 y 2021, asesor jurídico ante la Corte Internacional de Justicia, ha asesorado a órganos como el Consejo de Seguridad, el Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Y entre sus principales obras, que son muchas, hoy destacamos particularmente el libro Las Naciones Unidas y la cuestión de Palestina, sobre la que va a versar, digamos, la primera parte de su charla aquí hoy, en un intercambio que va a hacer conmigo. Esta obra ha sido publicada por la prestigiosa editorial, para los juristas la editorial probablemente más prestigiosa, Cambridge University Press, en 2023, y ofrece un estudio sistemático, profundo, sobre cómo la Organización de las Naciones Unidas ha abordado la cuestión palestina desde su creación. Bueno, y ahora voy a referirme simplemente a la metodología que vamos a seguir. He dicho que en una primera parte de la sesión, bueno, pues yo voy a hacer un intercambio. A mí me gusta seguir de una forma que creo que es un poco más fluida que dejar que el ponente suelte su discurso de manera continuada. Pues vamos a hacer un formato preguntas-respuestas que acortaré en función del tiempo que nos quede y sobre todo para dejar que la audiencia participe lo más posible y que, teniendo en cuenta además la situación actual, pues será un debate muy intenso. Professor Imseis, welcome to the Complutense University, welcome to the Faculty of Political Sciences and Sociology, welcome to Spain.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, I was saying that today's session will take more conversational format. I will begin by asking you some questions inspired by your book, and then we will open the floor for the audience questions. Professor Imseis, your book, The United Nations and the Question of Palestine, argues that the Palestinian question exposes a deep structural imbalances within the United Nations system. To what extent does this case, the Palestinian case, illustrate the limits of the United Nations as an organization devoted to justice and peace?
Well, Elena, thank you very much for the opportunity to engage in conversation with you, and also thank you very much for hosting me to the University of Complutense. Forgive me for not being able to speak in the Spanish language, but I do hope that I'm audible and understandable. Thanks as well to ICES and of course to dear Sonia Bulos at Nebrija, who arranged everything for me this week in Spain. Thank you. I suppose the best place to start is to appreciate what the United Nations is and what it isn't, or what it was meant to be, when, by whom, and for whom in 1945. Any of you who've read the UN Charter will be aware that there is, I should hope you should be aware, that there is embedded within it a tension between certain values. The way I read it is that these values are in two sort of streams. The first stream is the value of collective security. Following World War II, following World War I, the idea of collective security and a collective security arrangement was so important to ensure that the great powers that had ravaged one another for the previous 200 years, in Europe largely, but then in World War II and World War I more broadly, should never fight again, right? Thus, the creation of the permanent P5 powers in China, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and the United States. Their preeminence, if you like, in the system. They should not go to war. They will ensure collective security. That's the first value. The second value is one of universalism, universal human rights, equality before the law, self-determination of peoples, right? The normative force of what most of us, certainly me, when I was your age, affiliated or associated the United Nations with. That blue flag, that image, to me, meant human rights for all, right? So these values are embedded there. So, for instance, the principle of the sovereign equality of states. All states are equal, and yet, and that's embedded in the Charter, and yet, in the same Charter, the P5 powers are vested with authority, so we're also told at the same time that some states are more equal than others, to quote George Orwell. Yeah? This tension is a fixed feature of the organization. It cannot be resolved. Don't try and do that. Yeah? But you see it play itself out in how it is managed, the progressive development of international law, but also certain geopolitical conflicts. And in my case, I studied the question of Palestine and the United Nations management of it. For all of the work that has been done on Palestine, and it's very large, and all of the work that has been written on the United Nations, there has yet to be a book written on the UN's management or mismanagement of the question of Palestine. And so I did this, and what I found through my analysis of the record, the UN record, is that international law is repeatedly, regularly proffered by the United Nations as being, for the Palestinian people, the only route to justice. And yet when the Palestinians go for it and commit themselves on the basis of this promise given to them by the United Nations, the goalposts always seem to shift in the last minute. And oftentimes by the actions of the very same purveyor of that promise, being the United Nations. This has produced what I call international legal subalternity. It's something that I came up with. It's a bit of a mouthful. But the essence of it is to basically say that the UN and international law generally, but through the UN, has this tension built within it. Hegemonic power at the UN, and even by the UN, can use law in abusive ways or can overlook law in certain points, all the while proclaiming that it is the standard bearer, the organization is the standard bearer of the international rule of law. So you have this tension. And in the book I set out the positions of, when this tension sort of shows itself in the question of Palestine. I cover from 1947 just up to the beginning or just before the commission of the genocide, at the beginning of the genocide in October 2023, to show that this pattern, regardless of the contours of the international community, whether a Western-dominated General Assembly in 1947, 48, 49, or even a decolonized General Assembly in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, and even right up to the present moment where you have a unipolar, multipolar world again, the same theme exists in the Palestinian engagement with international law at the United Nations of legal subalternity. This is not to say, and I'll close my answer on this question, this is not to say that the UN is worthless, far from it, or that international law indeed is worthless, far from it. It is just to say that as thinking women and men and people, we must be aware of what law can do, what law cannot do, and disabuse ourselves of this notion that law is perfect or self-executing or going to be just. It is a tool. It can be used counter-hegemonically to push back against this abuse of authority. And this is the essence of, effectively, of my book. Subalternity of the weak parties in the world, not just Palestinians, women, indigenous peoples, non-self-governing peoples. Law can be used creatively to push back and gain ground towards a just result, but it isn't going to do it unless we do it ourselves.
For example, when we refer to the veto power in the Security Council, this is a system of domination of the great powers over the subaltern, yeah. And how this dynamic operate in the case of Palestine? Can you refer a little bit about the veto power?
Absolutely.
And its situation nowadays?
Absolutely. You would have all been watching the news over the past 23 months, and that's why you're all going to be sleeping here tonight, I should hope. The United States has used its veto power, I think, 6 times over the past 23 months to block what should, by all accounts, be something that is the most simple, basic demand in the face, however you want to characterize what's happening, genocide or war or whatever, in the face of atrocities being committed, to approve a ceasefire. It's very odd, and it's clearly being used or abused by the United States to allow Israel, an occupying force, a fascist force, an aggressor in the occupied territory, and so on, to continue its actions. I would commend to you, if you haven't done so, just go on UN Web TV. It's the United Nations sort of streaming service. And you could look at any of the monthly debates on the question of Palestine over the past 23 months. And you will see that it is literally 14 member states on the Security Council against 1, the United States. And then when the same debate is moved to the General Assembly of the United Nations, 193 member states, it's literally 170 states against the United States, Israel, and then those powerhouses of international relations from the South Pacific, Nauru, Palau, Micronesia, and Tuvalu, or something like that. The point is, the use and abuse by the United States of its veto to shelter and protect Israel is an example of legal subalternity. How? The US has the veto power by law. Read the charter. That's rule by law, not rule of law. It's law used to impose an order that in this case is being abused by its holder, the US. Right? So in my book, I discuss the differences between rule of law, the idea that all are equal before the law, government, individuals, and everybody in between, and rule by law, where law is abused and for hegemonic purposes. But what has happened with the US veto over the past 23 months is not unique. It goes all the way back to 1947. And indeed, it's not just the US, right? The other veto powers have used their authority as well and abused it. Less so, to be sure. Empirically speaking, the US has used its veto powers most than any other permanent 5 member. And over half of the times that it has used it is to defend one state, the state of Israel.
And can you trace a historical record of subalternity? I have a problem with this word.
It's okay, you've got it. Subalternity, basically weaker positions. Yeah, weakness on the international plane. Can I trace it?
Yes.
In the Palestine question?
Palestine question, yes.
Well,
Yes, Some moments.
The key moment in the reification or the crystallization of Palestine's legal subalternity is 1947 and the partition plan of the United Nations General Assembly. Let me take you back. The General Assembly then was not the same General Assembly as it is today. It was Western dominated, 51 member states, the vast majority of whom Western. And on the heels of the Holocaust, these Western states, and this is not my editorializing, I'm telling you what's in the record. I read every debate, every page, thousands of pages of debate in the General Assembly and the UN record. And I'm now relaying that to you. These Western states made it clear that they needed to establish a Jewish state in Palestine in order to make recompense for the Holocaust. They were very clear with this. Right? The so-called Jewish question, their words, not mine, needed to be resolved. And this clashed with a small minority of states who were arguing, this would have been Yugoslavia, then under the Tito regime, so communist, Iran, Pakistan, India, and a few Arab states that had received their independence in the 40s, Syria, and so on, Egypt, Yemen, Saudi Arabia. They had argued this is impossible. You cannot partition a country, the majority of whose population, then 2/3 of the population were Palestinian Arab. The 1/3 of the population of the country were freshly arrived immigrants, European Zionist settlers, who'd been there for a generation at most, starting in 1882, so maybe 2 generations. And they themselves arrived under the assistance of the British mandatory power, the colonizing power, who, under international law, attempted to create what they called a Jewish national home in a place full of non-Jews, right, through the Balfour Declaration. The General Assembly chose to partition the country, notwithstanding the fact that partition lacked consent of the governed, right? And if you read the record, it's just replete with racist notions of why the decision was taken. And of course, the decision was taken notwithstanding the fact that the same General Assembly who made the decision to partition knew that the British occupying power, mandatory power, would leave the territory with its police power, with its military, basically leave the indigenous Palestinian population unprotected, with the knowledge that the Zionists had trained with the British, had a militia called the Haganah, the underground forces of the Yishuv, and were prepared to use force against the Palestinian indigenous population if they refused to accept any form of Jewish sovereignty in the country. I'm relaying to you the evidence that was given by David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, to the United Nations in July 1947 in West Jerusalem at the YMCA, forgive me, which is a lovely hotel, by the way. The point is that the UN persisted to violate basic principles of self-determination of peoples in a Class A mandated territory, which was Palestine, for geopolitical reasons. Right? And this produced immediately thereafter the Nakba, the Civil War, and then the international armed conflict that resulted in the expulsion of 800,000 Palestinians and the creation of the Palestine problem thereby. Interestingly, immediately after, less than a year after the Nakba, the same General Assembly then has to debate the fallout of the 1948 war and their decision to partition. The same debates, the same permanent representatives and ambassadors, the same states, are now told by Yemen and Saudi Arabia, see, we told you so. This would happen. Now what are you going to do about it? So this created another thing, a new, wholly out of whole cloth, institutional and normative framework designed to deal with the Palestinian refugees that emerged from the 1948 conflict, the creation of UNRWA, where I used to be legal counsel, and a unique regime. For those of you who are interested, you should contrast the regime that is applicable to Palestinian refugees through UNRWA and those applicable to every other refugee on earth through the UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees. And this regime has produced over many decades all kinds of legal anomalies and protection gaps that only pertain to Palestinian refugees globally, right? That's another example of the use of law, rule by law, to reaffirm the subalternity of this group. It continues through 1967 and 2011. I could go on, and perhaps later on in question I can, but you can see that there are these moments in time, 47, the refugee problem, 67, and the failure of the international community through the UN to deal with the illegality of Israel's presence in the occupied territory. This was partially remedied with a case that I worked on at the ICJ that resulted in a landmark ruling in 2024, which I'm happy to talk to you about. And then finally, now with the inability of the State of Palestine to gain membership in the organization through the veto of the United States. It is a state, Palestine is, legally, no doubt about that, and yet its membership in the organization is blocked through the exercise by the United States of a veto cast on the 18th of April, 2024, and I happened to sit in the Security Council and watch the debate. It was comical. I shall never forget the Belize ambassador, a relatively diminutive woman. She couldn't stand more than 4 feet 5 inches. She was wearing her indigenous hat and clothing, and she had 2 of her comrades with her behind her, just the 3 of them. They walked into their seat at the Security Council, and she tore a strip off the United States. It was something to behold. This small state telling the US, the hegemon, what you're doing is terroristic against the Palestinian people. So to me, I took that message that the global South, the global majority are important. They use their access to the system, weak though they may be, to push back against hegemonic power. And you see this replicated in other places like the International Court of Justice now, with the South Africa case against Israel, or Nicaragua against Germany, and so on. So there are ways to push back and use law to bring back a real, truly sort of just world. But there's no guarantees that it will work. The point is, the hard work must be done. That's the process. We can't be cynical about it. We must engage.
You have talked about the International Court of Justice, and also there are some cases at the International Criminal Court. Do you think that these judicial avenues have any possibility of accountability for redress the Palestinian people?
I do, but only if men and women and people of conscience make it so. The law is not self-executing, and so just because, for instance, Palestine acceded to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, I believe in 2015, didn't mean that 10 years later we would have arrest warrants out. It took 10 years for the Office of the Prosecutor and the ICC to approve arrest warrants. So that meant that, politics never stops. You accede, you pressure the Office of the Prosecutor, you make sure they do their work, you fund that office, you get states to pressure the office to do the right thing, and so on. Now, just because we have the arrest warrants doesn't mean that states parties to the Rome Statute are going to arrest. Yeah. We saw Benjamin Netanyahu fly to the United States over the airspace of a number of parties to the Rome Statute who are required under international law to arrest and detain, and they did not. Or Hungary, for instance, who withdrew from its membership from the Rome Statute mechanism once the arrest warrants for Netanyahu were issued. So all this to say, you always have 1 step forward, 2 steps back in the process of accountability. You just need to be firm and believe in the justice of what you're doing and press on. So at the ICJ, one good example, the example that I sort of touched on earlier, Chapter 5 of my book sets out some of my research on the illegality of Israel's occupation of the occupied Palestinian territory. There have been a few scholars going back to 2005 who've written in this area, just a handful of people. All this to say that this chapter formed the basis of Palestine's case that resulted in the 2024 advisory opinion. There is, in this opinion, a seismic change, as Professor Boulos has written about, a seismic change in the international law as applicable to Israel-Palestine.
Why is it seismic? Why is it a massive change? Because up until that time, up until last July, the United Nations had assessed, documented, chapter and verse, all manner of violations by Israel, the occupying power, of its obligations in the occupied territory. Settlements are unlawful, usurpation of natural resources, unlawful, torture of the protected Palestinian population, unlawful. It just goes on, right? There wasn't anything that they didn't do that was lawful. But what the UN failed to do up until last summer was to determine the legality of the very regime giving rise to all of these discrete individual illegal actions. Israel's very presence in the territory, is that lawful? And the court came back with a verdict based on our argumentation and my work and so on, and others, that Israel's presence in the territory is in and of itself unlawful. It is an aggression, like Russia and Ukraine. Now, those of you who do international law will know, and this is important, you cannot justify an illegal use of force, like an aggression, through recourse to self-defense arguments. Now, how many of you are aware of the argument that is bandied about by Western politicians that Israel has a right to self-defense? Complete and utter nonsense. When it attaches, most importantly, to armed attacks that emanate from within the occupied territory. Israel is a state, it has an inherent right of self-defense, but not in relation to attacks that emanate from territory it occupies. Israel is in that territory unlawfully, in violation of Article 2, subsection 4 of the UN Charter. It is an aggressive power. It has one obligation, as affirmed by the court, well, one principal obligation, to withdraw as rapidly as possible. And the General Assembly received the opinion last September, well, rather 2 Septembers ago, 18 September 2024, Resolution ES-10/24. And when the GA received this resolution, it affirmed that Israel has 1 year from the date of the passage of that resolution to vacate the territory. The deadline was 18 September 2025, just a few weeks ago. Did Israel withdraw? No. We knew they wouldn't withdraw. Like the lawyers doing this case knew the Israelis wouldn't withdraw. So what do you think we're thinking about? Getting a deadline and the consequences of failing to meet that deadline, which require boycott, divestment, sanction, isolation, removal from the General Assembly, etc. Right? So law can be used creatively, and these ICJ cases are extremely important. This case is structural, much more important than the genocide case. Much more important. And I'll close on this. You might ask why. It goes to state responsibility. There is a law that we call state responsibility. When a state is engaged in an internationally wrongful act, it has the obligation to cease the act unconditionally, not to negotiate over the end of the act. It must cease the act. Second, it must give assurances of non-repetition of the act. And third, it must make appropriate forms of reparation for the illegal act and the consequences that flow from it. So if the court one day finds, which I believe it will, but if it does find that Israel's committed genocide, what must Israel do? Cease the act. Can you bring the dead people back? No. So you make recompense by payment and reparations, much like was done in the post-World War II Holocaust period, yeah? Does that deal with the structural violence of that which gave rise to the genocide itself, the presence of Israel in occupied Palestine? No, it doesn't. That's why this case, the 2024 advisory opinion case, is far more important than any case in the history of the question of Palestine, and used by lawyers at the ICJ in the knowledge of how they can tactically use this law, despite knowing that this court case is not going to self-execute. Now we need states to back it up. And people too.
May I pose another question before I give the... Okay. You have talked about the statehood of Palestine and the recognition of the statehood of Palestine has been felt and sold as a great success. But you, in your writings, consider that recognition can be seen as a form of concealment, symbolic gesture, but that makes the Palestinian cause not progressing.
Yeah.
Why? Why do you say this?
Yeah, I'm not as definitive as you put, dear Elena, but look, there's a fear that in the recent weeks, over the past 5 weeks or so, this rash of Western states that are now latecomers to the party of recognizing the state of Palestine, Canada, France, Australia, the United Kingdom, Malta, Belgium, Spain a little bit earlier, and they did it about a month or two ago, that there's a threat that it would just be symbolic. There's a lot of people in the Palestine solidarity movement, young people, maybe some of you, who, and I don't blame them for having this view, believe that this Western recognition of the state of Palestine in these circumstances, at a time when the Palestinian people are facing a genocide, is merely smoke and mirrors. It's merely an attempt to show their population, their young people who are protesting, that they're doing something, but in fact, it's nothing of substance. That's a legitimate position to hold. I don't hold it. And the reason why I don't hold it is because on the international plane, statehood is still king. In terms of the subjectivity of actors on the international plane, states are the highest order subject. States create law, they make law, but they also enjoy certain privileges and powers and authorities. One of them is the right to non-interference in internal affairs of the state. Another is the right to territorial integrity and political independence of the state. And another, as I just mentioned, is the right to self-defense when subjected to an armed attack that is unlawful. Now you can see where I'm going with it, right? If these Western states merely recognize the state of Palestine but do not follow it up with policy changes in their relationship with Israel that are consistent with these principles of international law that attach to all states, the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of the state of Palestine, the principle of the territorial integrity and political independence of the state of Palestine, the principle of the right of the state of Palestine to use force proportional and necessary in the event that it is subjected to an unlawful use of force and an armed attack against it, then such recognitions will simply be symbolic. But that means now is the time for us to use these recognitions collectively, people like you, other states, trade unions, to pressure Spain, who's done a good job to be sure, but certainly France, Australia, Canada, and so on, the United Kingdom, to change their policies vis-a-vis Israel, who is violating the territorial integrity and political independence of Palestine, who is committing an aggression against the state of Palestine, now recognized by London, and so on, right? So all this to say that it's not enough to be cynical, we must engage, and to use international law creatively, and on law's terms itself, right? It's there to be used. So there is a right, for instance, for the Palestinians to use force to resist the illegal occupation. It's not an unqualified right. They have to respect international humanitarian law. They can't attack civilians or civilian objects and so on. And individual criminal responsibility should flow from that if they do attack, as happened on the 7th of October. I don't deny that. Yeah. Mind you, some attacks on the 7th of October were perfectly lawful, right, against military targets and military installations and so on. But you remove now that the state of Palestine is recognized by these Western states who are friends of Israel and who support Israel militarily, diplomatically, and so on. You remove in those states the discourse that it's only Israel that has a right of self-defense. Now the right of self-defense attaches to the state of Palestine when you're in Canada. And it is without a doubt that the state of Palestine is suffering from an illegal occupation, which is an aggression in violation of Article 2, subsection 4 of the UN Charter, which cannot be remedied by reference to arguments of self-defense. Israel has no right of self-defense to maintain its position in the territory. Zero. It has an obligation to leave. And so those states who now recognize Palestine have an obligation to change their policies vis-a-vis Israel to stop the arms trade, to stop providing them with diplomatic cover in the General Assembly and the Security Council, to ensure that their own nationals do not serve in the IDF, and if they do, that they're prosecuted when they come back home. All of that is perfectly lawful. And these are entry points for using law counter-hegemonically.
Okay, Professor Imseis, thank you very much. I have some questions. Anyway, I want to pose another question because to have the right to self-defense, you need to be recognized as a state. So,
Is Palestine a state? Yeah.
Yes. So, in this case, the recognition is something that gives strength to the Palestinian cause.
It does. Certainly it does. I mean, in the most basic terms, what you're seeing now, over the past 23 months, is an attempt by Israel to destroy the Palestinian nation as a national group in its homeland. That's very clear. So it's extremely important for states to recognize that Israel has no sovereignty in occupied Palestine, and only the Palestinians are sovereign there, and the state of Palestine is a reality. It does exist on the international plane, recognized by 160 states. It appears before the ICJ, and only states can do that.
Okay.
So.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Professor Imseis. This has been a very interesting intervention, and now I will open the floor for the questions of the audience. I am sure that people here are eager to participate. We have this conversation framed by the war in Gaza.
¿Me señalas a quién atribuyes la palabra?
So, please, before you take the word, please keep your questions concise and introduce yourselves before you take the word. And if you don't speak English, we'll try to translate your question. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Emma. I'm from Italy, and I've been part of the Palestinian solidarity movement in different countries at this point. And my question is more of, may seem kind of basic, but it's how do we still have hope? Because honestly, we've seen like a lot of mobilization around like people, like here in Spain, in Italy, in Europe in general. And now that the ceasefire finally has come, I think the spotlight will turn off, and I'm scared that once again the whole situation will go under, kind of not talked anymore. And how do we still have hope for international law, for the UN, when we've seen them failing for the past 2 years? So especially as young people, and I think active people for the cause, it's very hard to keep hope. So that's my question.
Great question, and I'm happy to answer it right away. Keep hope because the Palestinian people are hopeful. Despite what you see on the ground, they've been completely decimated in Gaza, 67,000 at minimum dead, 135,000 injured, many other tens of thousands buried under the rubble. It goes on. But the Palestinian people, despite this unprecedented experience in their history, are not the first people to suffer such travesties. History is very long, and so too is the existence of the indigenous people of Palestine who have been there from time immemorial, and, I'm glad to say, will continue to be there for time immemorial and into the future. There is an attempt to do away with them, there's no doubt about that. So how you keep hope is to keep your values straight and steady. Don't be fooled by the fact that the media and your political elites are now telling you, like Donald Trump did yesterday, peace in our time. Utter nonsense. It is good that there's a ceasefire. Up until the ceasefire, on average of 100 Palestinians a day were being killed. So any day where you have a ceasefire, you're saving 100 Palestinians. That's a good thing. The Israelis are not going to vacate the occupied territory. The Israelis have made it very clear, publicly, openly, in the General Assembly and in their laws, their basic laws, that there will be no Palestinian state established anywhere between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And so their fundamental desire to displace and replace the Palestinian people, whether through in one fell swoop of a military operation, bombardment, starvation, or over time, a decade here, a decade there, will not stop. They mean what they say. And so keep hope around the fact that you know you're right, that you're on the right side of history, that international law does matter, aside from the fact that it's being violated left, right, and center, and keep pressing on. There's a reason why the Italians sent that naval ship to go help the Freedom Flotilla, the Smoot Flotilla. And it was because of all of the stoppage of work in the cities in Italy. So the people have power. You need to understand your role in that. People need to understand your role in that. And press and not stop. For my part, I won't stop. I will continue doing what I do in my own little world, pointy-headed lawyer at the courts and all of that. But your job is to get your voice out there and speak to anybody who's willing to listen and put pressure, political pressure, economic pressure, cultural pressure. Remove Israel from FIFA and UEFA, everything and anything. Don't stop. That's how apartheid ended in South Africa, and that's precisely how it's going to end in occupied Palestine.
Okay, another question, and then...
Exactly.
Well, I do think that the UN needs a reform, an internal reform, when it comes to the Security Council and the question of the veto power. But I also believe that the fact that the UN doesn't have some form of executive power, especially when it comes to a big hegemonic nation such as the US, then it will be fundamentally useless, because all it can do is recommend some form of resolution. But it cannot coerce those big nations into doing anything. We've seen it with the Netanyahu case, the fact that he's been flying above European nations, although there's he's supposed to be arrested at this point, but nobody has done anything. And I think it comes from the fact that we cannot really do anything against big powers that have all the political but also economic power in the world.
Right, so I appreciate very much that that's how you feel, and I should think that that's how many people do feel. Sadly, I disagree with you, and this is the reason why. There is a huge disconnect between the political elites that govern the Western minority powers on the planet, by which I mean maybe a handful, 2 handfuls of powers, the G7, the global north, the political elites that govern them, and the people. Right? Take Italy as a perfect example. There's a huge disconnect between the people on Palestine and the political elites on Palestine. It's true the political elites have their control of power, the economy, the military, and so on, but that doesn't mean that hope is lost. Quite the contrary. I've been working on the question of Palestine since I was 16, during the first Intifada, when I was in high school. Yeah. And never in my life have I seen as much solidarity with the people of Palestine as I see today in all of my life. And so I'm heartened by that. Who could have ever thought, think about this, that Israel, the startup state, the victim state, the state that was created out of the ashes of the Holocaust, a horrible thing to be sure, but arose from the Holocaust like a phoenix out of the flames, a miracle state. Who would have ever thought that within living memory, that state would now be before the International Court of Justice on allegations of genocide? The Palestinian people do not have the benefit of a large economy or a military to defend itself or any of that. But we do have morality, we do have the people globally, the global majority, and in the end, justice will be done. There is a boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. Focus on that. Don't stop. Change will happen.
Isaías, tenemos aquí primero una palabra que había pedido antes y después te doy la palabra a ti y luego ya se ha animado este sector. Creo que quizá os había perdido un poco de vista. ¿Me decís quiénes queréis?
Yeah.
Adelante.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, you've spoken about the veto power and how the US has multiple times abused it. Do you think there is a world of international law possible where there are no veto powers, where maybe the world could be better without? Because in my opinion, I agree with you. I think the veto powers do not necessarily make our world a better place, but do you think it's possible in the far future, near future, where that's not here?
Thank you very much for the question. There are a number of studies and academics who've made proposals over the years, including diplomats, to change and reform the United Nations, in particular around the veto power. In fact, I was interviewed by this Belgian documentary fellow on a documentary he put together called The Veto. So you might see it at some stage or another. And the problem with that is that the only way you can change the veto power at the United Nations is through amending the UN Charter. And you can't amend the UN Charter without the authority of the permanent 5 veto powers, right? So what we would need in a new world of the sort that you describe, is a paradigmatic moment on the order of World War II, in which states come together and say, actually, that system failed, let's adopt something new. And in a world of hegemons and great powers, I'm a realist in this sense, I can't see that happening. And not only the veto power going away as such, but proverbially speaking. The hegemons will always want to have some control that is higher, better, more normative, more forceful than the other states. That's difficult. So for the meantime, we have to deal with what we have. But it's okay. Just because the veto power is being abused by the US doesn't mean there aren't other options. There are. Use of the ICJ is another option. The General Assembly and the Uniting for Peace power is another option. You can move to the General Assembly where the Security Council is blocked by a veto power. You can take the same issue and have the GA pass a non-binding resolution. But because it's non-binding, it isn't the end of the story. Once they pass the resolution and they articulate what their will is, the will of the international community, then you can argue that each constitutive member of the General Assembly, each state, is bound by the principles that they're pushing and should act individually. States can still act individually to change their bilateral relations with Israel. They don't have to do it in conformity or together in the UN. So there are many, many things that can be done. You just have to be creative with how you do it. And the thing is, the West, the elites, including in the West, want you to feel powerless. They really do. Don't. Just understand how the system operates and use it.
Teníamos una palabra ahí atrás y aquí tenemos 3. Os tengo controlados.
I'm not an expert in international law, but I wanted to ask, how important, because I have been through different protests throughout all of these 23 months, and I have seen indeed that the group of people that goes has grown and that there's a more diverse group of people. But how important, so globally, yes, there's an increase of people that support the Palestinian cause, but it might sound very stupid, but how important would you say it is for people in Israel to change their opinion of it? Because I was reading a book by Wendy Brown about walls that was very interesting. She talked about how all of these walls that are being built, even in the front border with Morocco and Spain, that all of these walls are sort of a way for states to perform a power and sovereignty that really they don't have or that they're losing. And in the case of Israel, it's the quintessential example with all of those walls in the occupied areas. And in the book, she talks about how those walls, they not only divide or stop people from coming in, but it also, in a way, traps the people inside into a narrative that they cannot escape. So
I always look at the protest or like the images from Israel, and I always wonder how important it is for those people to, and if it is even possible, how could it be possible for those people to escape the trap that they're in?
Yeah, very good question. Look, the way I view it is through the historical lens, and also the lens of humanism. We're all human. Israeli Jews are human, you're human, I'm human. We all have our vices, we all have evil in us, we all have good in us. These things are existing everywhere. We have the propensity to act like sheep to our slaughter and create myths and mythologies about who we are in the world and to justify anything, really, as is on full display in the Israeli media in justifying the genocide. I don't think that Israeli Jewish society is beyond recall. Not unlike any other society. We can all change. We have to believe that. That's where the hope comes from, right? Will it happen soon? I don't think so. I think Israeli Jews need to be helped to understand that Columbus did not discover America, right? And sadly, as is the way of settler colonial societies, the process of the settler colonialist coming to terms with their history will come at a great cost in both time and bodies. All of it Palestinian. That's a guarantee. But I don't think the change is not going to happen. It will. So that means the pressure needs to be brought to bear on Israeli Jewish society. They need to be de-Zionized, basically. The idea that there should be any Jewish supremacy, any supremacy of ethnic, religious, racial supremacy of any sort, anywhere on the planet is something of an age gone by. And yet Israel stands out as on its own in this respect. It's in their laws, it's in their society, it's in their practices, in their culture, in their actions. This will end, it's inevitable, but over time. And the way we can hasten this is to ensure that we maintain a commitment to our values of humanism, universal values, human rights, international law, and keep pressing that, despite the difficulties that we are bound to face. That's inevitable. Just press on and don't stop. There must be a change at some stage or another. Look at Japan and Germany now, as an example. Not to say that these are, great places, but you get my point. I studied that Columbus did discover America as a child when I was in Canada growing up. And now we are coming to terms, the settler society is coming to terms with the indigenous genocide that we committed. The same will happen in Palestine. I'm certain of it. Not within my lifetime, though. Yeah.
Por aquí teníamos tres palabras, una, dos y había una tercera. Empezamos por aquí. Dos y creo que había otra persona más, ¿no?
I just had a question about, we've kind of seen in the past how the kind of international shock of genocide has changed the way in which the UN has approached genocide, so kind of responsibility to protect coming in after various failures in the 90s. Is this going to change how the UN approaches genocide then going forward?
I don't think so, sadly. I think the United Nations is a funny thing. It is at once the sum of its parts, being states, and therefore the decisions that are taken by the states, the sum of its parts, are always going to be animated by the interests of those states, political interests. Some of them view what's happening as a genocide, some of them view what's happening as not a genocide, it's self-defense on the Israeli side and so on. They're in the minority, to be sure. And then the UN is also an independent organization. So if you have a look at how the Secretary General has led the independent organization of the UN on the question of genocide, he's been silent about the genocide. He's not felt himself able to say it's a genocide. And the reason is, it's implied, I'm surmising, but I think it's a pretty safe bet on my part to say that the reason why he's done that is because his principal judicial organ, the ICJ of the UN, is seized of the matter of genocide in the South Africa-Israel case. He doesn't want to prejudice any of that case by calling it a genocide. But to be sure, there's nothing in international law or the United Nations law or the relationship between the Secretariat and the ICJ that forbids the Secretary General from calling it a genocide. So there's always going to be within this political animal of the UN a politicization of things. Our job, your job, my job, and so on, is to ensure that the law, as applied to the facts, is clear. And to my mind, that is inevitably going to result in a sad verdict, but one that will vindicate the people who are on the receiving end of it all now. Will it fundamentally change how the UN treats genocide? I don't think so. Lastly, again, you've had reports of great atrocities, UN reports, post-atrocity reports that say, we should have learned lessons. See the Sri Lanka report, right? As an example. I think it was done by Alvaro de Soto. Nothing has been learned. Rwanda, nothing has been learned. Why is this? It's political. It's political. It is in this case the attempt by one hegemonic power to defend a settler colonial power in the region for domestic US purposes. That's the only reason why it's happening, in my view. Yep.
Por aquí teníamos una palabra, por ahí otra, y luego por aquí también se ha levantado. Creo que primero estabas alguno de vosotros dos, ¿sí? Y...
Thank you. My name is Linda, I'm from Italy. And my question would be around the fact that a lot of people around the world I felt like their government, the media, the Western narrative failed them because what they were told was not the truth since the beginning. And my question would be, if you think that it might lead to an awakening in the future of the public opinion, but at the same time also a weakening of what the international system will be too, this kind of dualism.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I do think that. I think your thinking on that is right. So with the events of the past 23 months, there is no doubt in my mind that the vast majority of people on earth who've made their voices heard on this issue realize the folly of Zionism. Even American Zionist Jews are turning against Zionism. We are now witnessing the beginning of the end of political Zionism. I'm certain of it, right? The Zionists have lost the legitimacy war through their own hand in the genocide that they're perpetrating against the Palestinian people. So people have been awoke and wakened. People are also cynical, and rightfully so, because of what appears to be a complete lack of ability of the international community to respond to this thing in any real way. This is where I think a lot of work needs to be done by people like me, but also you, if you feel the need to, I should hope, to remind yourselves of the following. Law, human rights, not self-executing. It's written on paper. It just doesn't mean because it's written on paper that it's going to manifest itself in human relations. Domestically, murder is murder. The law is clear. You cannot take another person's life. But does that mean that in society, murder won't happen? It doesn't. Murder is going to happen. The issue is what role we play as individuals, collectives, regional, international, at the national level, in the state level. What do we do to give strength to the law that is already there? We must not lose hope on that. And the reason why we must not lose hope is because we all have a stake in it. Gaza is just the beginning, the thin end of the wedge. Yeah? If it could happen there, it'll happen someplace else. I'm a Manchester United fan, not a fan of Manchester City, but Pep Guardiola, the manager of Manchester City, says it right. He says if it happens in the Mediterranean, in the Eastern Mediterranean, without even using the word Palestine, but he knows what he's saying. If it happens there, who's to say it's not going to happen in Spain? One day, right? The point is we all have a stake. That means you must believe and you must devote yourself to these things to make change. Our history shows us. Think about men like Lauterpacht or Lemkin, survivors and people who are connected to the Holocaust, who created the idea of genocide after the Holocaust. This comes from hope and a conviction of justice and what is right and to ensure that justice be done. We should all have this. I should hope.
Hello, my name is Laura, and I'm a student of International Relations. My question is more related to the ceasefire, as someone who has been observing the way that Israel behaves and how much they actually comply to the things that they have agreed on. I just wanted to ask you what confidence you have in this ceasefire and what do you think we should expect from this moment onward?
The short answer is I have zero confidence in the ceasefire. Only because I'm a thinking human who, like you, has witnessed decades of what the Israelis have been doing in the occupied territory. And so take the following from what I say. It's a good thing that there will be a ceasefire for a few days, a week, maybe 2, maybe even 3. The fact of the matter is, Israel will not be leaving the occupied Gaza Strip. It, by its own terms, will not be leaving the occupied Palestinian territory. It is legislated and is acting upon a policy designed to do one thing. They're open about it: to displace the Palestinian population out of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and to replace them with Israeli Jewish settlers, because according to their own law, only the Jewish people are sovereign between the river and the sea. They're open about that. I take them seriously, right? Mr. Trump has no credibility. He walked away from the ACJPOA or whatever it is, the Iran deal. He walked away from it. If you have the US Central Command in Qatar for decades, and that can't buy you defense from an attack by Israel, who's a very close ally to the United States, where is the credibility of the United States? Zero credibility. What will happen is you'll have the exchange of prisoners, there may be a ceasefire, some humanitarian aid is let in, but the Israelis have their hand on the tap of the humanitarian aid. They've been doing it for decades. They will continue to starve the Gazan population, to sequester that population in the southwest, in Al-Mawasi and other areas. Disease will fester and set in, and they will wait and wait it out. They won't be able to do the ethnic cleansing as they had hoped in October and November 2023, when they ordered 1.1 million people out of Gaza City and into the south. They wanted them to go into the Sinai. They won't be able to do it in one fell swoop. They will do it over time. That's their goal. We know that. We must respond to that in any way we can. The Palestinians in Gaza have responded. That's why they're being genocided. Many of them want to leave. Many of them don't want to leave. And because they don't leave, they get killed. They choose not to leave because the Palestinians, we are traumatized generationally by the idea of leaving. So they won't leave. BDS. Costs need to be brought to bear on the Israelis and those who support them for their fascist, apartheid, genocidal policies. Do not stop. You have power, make it so.
So this is a point that's been German, and this is a point that's been reverberated by my government a lot. But they consider that the last parliamentary elections across all of Palestine were in 2006, resulting into the division that's being exploited now by the Israeli extremist government between Hamas-governed Gaza and the Fatah-governed West Bank. And according to my government, this means that neither faction fulfills the Montevideo Convention's criterion of a government capable of exercising effective control over a territory and its people. Who do you consider to be the legitimate representative of the state of Palestine, to whom the sovereign authorities that you mentioned throughout your speech should be attributed to, such as the right to self-defense and the protection of the Palestinian peoples?
The state of Palestine, led by the Palestine Liberation Organization, that state is recognized by 160 other states on planet Earth. Their representatives of the PLO represent the state of Palestine at the United Nations Organization, including, in and among other places, Geneva, its headquarters, New York, its headquarters, and so on. So the Palestinian position is very clear, including as affirmed by the groups that are not part of the Palestine Liberation Organization, so Hamas and the Islamic groups and so on. They all made it very clear the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people in the conduct of its foreign relations since at least 1964 is the Palestine Liberation Organization. So that question is one for the ages. You know, it's not a real question that is live today. When I say one for the ages, it's something that used to circulate in the 80s and stuff, when there were attempts made to delegitimize the Palestinians as a group, as a national group, and so on. But today, the state of Palestine is an entity, a state, a juridical entity. It behaves as a state. It's treated as a state on the international plane by the vast majority of other states. It has a rich treaty practice. It's signed off on most international humanitarian law, human rights law, general international law treaties. It appears before the International Court of Justice, as only states may do. Right? It is a state. It is recognized by the General Assembly of the United Nations as a non-member observer state. It's a state. And it is represented by the Palestine Liberation Organization. In terms of the division of the Palestinians, clear division between Fatah and Hamas, that's true. There have been attempts to bridge that division. I think the last one was in Beijing just a few months ago, 6 months ago or so. And certainly the events today, certainly with the Trump plan and the US position that the Palestinian Authority or PLO leadership should not be allowed to come to New York for the UN General Assembly, Trump and the Israelis are trying to maintain the division between the West Bank and so read the Trump plan. There's very little reference to, there's no reference to Palestine, there's no reference to the PLO. There's reference to the Palestinian Authority but needing to be reformed, and elections needed to be had. Very important. But how do you have elections and hold them in a free and fair way, especially in East Jerusalem, which is the capital of the occupied state of Palestine, when the Israelis don't recognize the right of the state of Palestine, A, to exist, B, to even be in East Jerusalem, C, to therefore hold elections in East Jerusalem. So the fact that there might be some difficulties in governance on the ground in real terms, in French we call it effectivité, right? Is not, if you like, it does not obliterate or vitiate the claim of Palestine to be a state, and that is because those limitations on the ability of the state of Palestine to exercise governmental function are being impeded by an aggressive occupying power operating in bad faith who wants to colonize their territory. So I've looked at, in chapter 6 of my book, the statehood of Palestine. I've applied the Montevideo Convention criteria, but based on the state practice of Montevideo Convention application. And the state practice since 1955 in UN admission practice across the board is to apply the 4 Montevideo criteria for statehood: a permanent population, a fixed territory, government, and the ability to engage in foreign relations, to apply those 4 criteria liberally, permissively, and very openly. And so there's no question in my mind at all, based on practice, recognition, and the application of the Montevideo criteria, that the state of Palestine exists and that it is represented by the Palestine Liberation Organization Executive Committee.
Creo que había primero algunas palabras por aquí, aquí delante, aquí, y luego hay una por allí detrás y luego por aquí.
Are we ready? Okay. Thank you so much for this intervention. My name is Antonia, I'm Bulgarian. What I want to ask you is kind of related to the concept of hope that we talked about. So within the pro-Palestinian movement, we have applied pressures on our local governments, on the United Nations, the ICJ, etc. And despite the progress that you have talked about, we have not seen still the de facto liberation of the Palestinian people. And that has led to, I would say, a significant amount of people within the pro-Palestinian movement to consider the only thing that is left to achieve the liberation is military intervention. So I wanted to ask, do you think that this is possible? What would it look like, and what can it achieve for the Palestinian people?
Yeah.
Thank you.
A great question, thank you. But before I answer it, I just want to make a quick intervention with my colleague. Are we good on time for the next event, Sonia? Till 1 o'clock? Okay, that's good. Because I'm fine, yeah. And I quite like this exchange, so thank you. Military intervention, extremely important. In principle, should be happening. It should have happened months ago, no doubt. certainly based on the so-called responsibility to protect doctrine, which I'm sure you would have studied, that the Western states, Canada led this press in the late 1990s in the Kosovo conflict, that where a state is violating the rights of the people subject to its jurisdiction, other states have an obligation to intervene to protect that population and so on. This is a political postulate, it's not really law. I wonder where this concept of responsibility to protect has gone in the face of everything that is happening over the past 23 months. The Western states are quiet about it, to be sure. Now, the problem with military intervention is not principle. In principle, the Palestinian people deserve it. They are owed it. States have the authority to do it. And if the state of Palestine were to request it formally of the international community, states who provided material, troops, and so on, would be acting lawfully if they did. The problem is political will. Military intervention in the occupied Palestinian territory means necessarily war with the IDF and, by extension, the United States. How many states on earth are prepared to do that? I was very delighted to see that the Spanish had sent their frigate, or that naval ship, or whatever it was, to escort the Freedom Flotilla or the Smooth Flotilla. I knew when they did it that there would come a point in time, perhaps when the flotilla hit the territorial waters of Gaza or just before, that the Spanish would stop and hand the flotilla over to the Israeli Navy. And that is because I know the Spanish will not go to war with Israel. You need political will to do that. So that's the problem. There is no political will. So in the face of this realistic thing, right, let's be Machiavellian about it. The fact that no state wants to go to war with the United States or can go to war with the United States and Israel over Palestine for any number of reasons, we need to find other entry points for action, non-forcible entry points for action. Boycott, divestment, sanction. This does not mean that force in principle is not possible, or that the Palestinian people don't have the right under international law to use force in self-defense of their territorial integrity, their political independence, their right to self-determination, and certainly to stop the genocide against them.
Do we have enough time until 1 o'clock? Okay, so we are overusing, Professor.
I flew all the way from Jordan, so I'm happy to spend time with you. That's fine. Khalas.
There was another word over there. No? It's okay? Okay.
Okay, hello. I have a question about, a moment I lost hope in international law was the 22nd of June, also when the USA bombed Iran in their nuclear seats, but I just really want to know, what was the interest of the USA? What do you think it was? And how was this indirectly accepted by the international community? Because I was really confused when this happened, because there was not much reaction against the USA, so...
Yeah. I don't think that the bombing of Iran was accepted by the international community as such. It's an unlawful use of force against Iran. I think the reason why the United States engaged in that action has to do much more with domestic U.S. politics around the relationship with Israel. I could have a whole lecture on this. I would commend to you the book done by two United States international relations scholars, and for those who do international relations here, you will know their names. John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt wrote a book called The Israel Lobby, which discusses the power of the Israel lobby, perfectly legitimate lobby, although they engage, in my view, in illegitimate actions, in the United States, which has made the question of Israel not a foreign policy issue in the United States, but a domestic policy issue. It's a funny thing, if you ever watch U.S. electoral debates in the Midwest, in Iowa, or Wisconsin, you'll have a debate in a small town hall, not unlike this, and everybody will be talking about the price of lunch at school and school buses and bridges over the local river, and who loves Israel more. I'm serious. I'm dead serious. right? So it's a cross-party issue, Democrat, Republican, and built up over many, many decades, such that Benjamin Netanyahu can show up at the US Congress, not having been invited there by President Barack Obama, offend President Barack Obama in the Congress repeatedly, and be given standing ovations by the whole of the Congress. Because these people want to be elected to office. And the lobby operates in such a way to make it difficult to be elected if you do not toe a pro-Israel line. See Mearsheimer and Walt, the Israel lobby, and you will then understand why the United States executive takes decisions in Israel's interests in the region, including bombing of Iran, or moving away from the JCPOA, the Iran deal, and so on. It's completely anti-American and runs completely counter to American national interest. More and more Republican Americans are realizing this now. The MAGA base for Trump is now pushing back against Trump because of it. This is a good thing, a very good thing.
The only good thing.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Jad and I'm from Italy. What I wanted to say is that the best way that we could see international law to go now, and that is still very optimistic, is prosecution and condemnation of the Israeli government right now, Netanyahu and his ministers. But what I fear is that that would lead to an absolution of the people, the Israeli, that have been grown with these beliefs of supremacy and that it's and dehumanization of the Palestinian people. And my question is that avoidable? Like, what jurisdiction does international law hold over cultural traditions and beliefs?
I'm trying to think. It's an interesting question for which I'm thankful. Look, the quick response, my gut response, is that international law has nothing to say about how people politically organize themselves, including around ideologies, with the exception if those ideologies violate human rights. But even then, because of certain principles of international law, including the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of a state, how a state governs itself, according to what ideology it governs itself, is outside of the jurisdiction of other states to judge, right? So you might have racist states who have racist ideologies, who Human Rights Watch and you and I sitting on the outside say, oh, that's violative of human rights. But there's no law in international law that allows states to enter, third states to enter into the territory of that state to save the people from the ravages of this ideology, right? You had the responsibility to protect doctrine, but it's not legal, it's political, right? So then you need to figure out ways, creative ways, to put pressure on these states to change. The apartheid South Africa case is the case in point, and it is being followed by us on the Palestinian file. This is our Namibia moment. We're doing exactly what they did, the ANC and the Namibians and so on did. In fact, at the ICJ, the South Africans and the Namibians are the most supportive of the work that we do. Like in the case on the 2024 advisory opinion, we made argument on apartheid, that Israel is an apartheid state. But the South Africans and the Namibians said, give it to us, let us make the case. And we did. And they made a much better case for obvious reasons. So you can put pressure using law from the outside, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, and so on, but you can't reach into a society and change how it's been brainwashed, if you like. That's a long-term process. And as I said, Israeli Jewish people are not immutable. It's inevitable. They're human like us. They can change their minds. They will. When costs are brought to bear on them. They love their football. They really do. That's why I signed a letter the other day to the president of FIFA. You can imagine what I asked him to do.
My question is about the application of international law, because as we've seen, like the advisory opinion of the International Court and the statehood of Palestine, it has legal implications, but if Israel doesn't have a will to accomplish them, he's not going to do it, so we have to enforce it in some way. So my question is, how are we supposed to do that if the two political systems with more capacities in order to do that are the European Union and the United States, doesn't want to do it? Because at the end of the day, the political or the public opinion in Europe can be more pro-Palestine, maybe, but we have states that are in no way, they are not gonna be, they're not gonna let that to happen. I mean Germany especially. So how are we supposed to do something to make international law to be accomplished?
Yeah. Very good question, and we could spend days talking about it. There are many different action points, local, regional, international, that can be taken. You speak of the EU, for instance. It's tough to get 27 member states of the EU to agree on anything, certainly not on this. So if you're unable to act as a group, EU, then the states individually have to act. They're legally obliged to act, each individual state. Then pressure needs to be brought to bear on the executives and the governments in those states. Where the elites in those states are unwilling or unable to act, then you go to the regional level. Look at the unions in Italy. Ordinary paisans sitting there talking about stopping the ships from moving to Tel Aviv ports and to Haifa ports. And they organize, right? So there are ways to put pressure on political elites in your country to change the policies. I promise you this, those political elites are not going to willingly change those policies. If you don't pressure them, they're going to sit at home, eat their food, play their cards, do whatever they do. Your job, our job, is to put pressure in any possible way we can at the universities, at university administrations, in the media, with media organizations, on the social media, at the local level, at the regional level. Organize. If everybody pushes at once, over time, the anti-apartheid movement will produce costs, reputational costs, financial costs. What they're hoping on you to do now is to sit on your hands and say, the ceasefire's there. Or, nothing can be done. It's all in the control of these political elites, and what can I possibly do to change that? Don't take that view. Don't take that view. You're like me, huh? Just act in any way you can, at every level. Take to the streets, man. I'm serious. Aren't you guys sleeping here tonight? That's what I understand. Hey, I'm not advising you on what happens if you get arrested, but, you know.
All right, I have a question on the concept that you explained of international legal subalternity, because I think it's a very interesting topic that I've never heard of. And I think this is a clear example of how law is interconnected with politics at the end of the day. Because as we can see, politics is about power, and at the end of the day, in the UN, we saw that these hegemonic powers use their power, so their political will to exercise this power. So I was wondering, would you say that the shift also in the Arab countries bordering Palestine is due to this ability of these hegemonic countries to exercise their power, and that these countries, at the end of the day, they've given up their ideals and what they stood for their own private interests, security, economics, etc.?
Yep, great question. It's very frustrating to see, for me at least, that the Arab states have yet to really take any substantial action in response to what the Israelis are doing. In fact, trade continues with many of these Arab states, gas trade between Egypt and Israel and others, as an example. None of the Arab states have withdrawn their ambassadors from Israel who have diplomatic relations with Israel. They've not withdrawn their ambassadors even, which is the most basic thing to do. So one wonders why that is, and I'm just one person, so I offer you my view. The Arab state system is in complete disarray and has been for some decades, since at least 1967. And of course, it's not a new thing in any case. I mean, the Arab state system, such as it is a figment of the Western imperial powers through Sykes-Picot. I'm sure you know your history. So all this to say that these powers, many of them owe the political elites who run the governments in those powers, they owe their seat of power not to the people. They don't derive their authority from the will of the people or the consent of the governed. They derive their authority, frankly, because they've been hand-selected or are being propped up by other powers. Does that mean that that absolves them of responsibility for their lack of decisions, their omissions, their actions, and so on in the face of these atrocities being committed against their brethren, ostensibly their brethren and their sisters in Palestine? Absolutely not. There's blame to go around. But there's a reason for it. And we need to be clear about that. But I do find it interesting to see that the Spanish have taken leadership, boycott, arms trade embargoes, and so on, where the Arab states are unable to, or indeed unwilling. I take the view realistically that Palestine is alone. There's no question in my mind that if 23 months of genocide hasn't shown us anything, or has shown us anything, it's that Palestine stands alone on the international plane. No states are willing to do that which is sufficient to end the genocide to help the Palestinians. There's some stuff going on. Nicaragua, South Africa, Spain, Belgium, some sanctions, some cases here and there. But in the face of this live stream genocide, it's astounding the non-response of political elites in states. At the same time, the people have spoken in the complete opposite way, haven't they? The people are standing up, the students are standing up saying, "Not in my name." That is something we can take heart from. There's a tension between these things. And the young people one day will be in power. You will all be running the show. Don't forget your values.
Hello, my name is Anna, and I have a question related to the humanitarian aid that was briefly mentioned earlier, but also, or especially its role in the possible perpetuation of the conflict or of the occupation. And you've mentioned before how some might argue that the recognition of Palestine now recently by more and more countries, how it could be simply of some symbolic nature, even though you've said that you don't agree with it, or at least partially not. But I was wondering, looking back historically, I mean, the EU has been a pretty big contributor of humanitarian aid, but without sizable or relevant contributions or commitments that might put an end to the actual occupation that was causing the need for humanitarian aid in the first place. So I was wondering, especially then before these more recent developments in terms of the recognition of the state of Palestine, would you not consider this type of support then in the form of humanitarian aid of more symbolic nature, or even more importantly, as having a role in the perpetuation or giving a certain degree of legitimization to the occupation and to the conflict? Thank you.
Yeah, great question, and you're not the first person to have asked it. There's no question that to the extent, well, the first place to begin is to appreciate that situations of foreign military occupation are meant to be temporary. Temporary. The longest occupations, aside from Western Sahara and Palestine, since World War II were of Japan and Germany after the war. And they lasted for 7 and 10 years, respectively, I think. It's meant to be temporary, and occupation does not give the occupying power sovereignty. The occupying power must govern in accordance with international humanitarian law, in the interests of the protected Palestinian population in this case, but withdraw eventually. Now, the Israelis have made it clear they have no intention of withdrawing. They're colonizing the territory, and they're doing so over many decades. So to the extent that third states, including the EU as a group of states, have provided humanitarian and developmental aid over many decades since 1993 to the Palestinian population in the occupied territory, some of this aid building roads and schools only to be destroyed by the occupying power and then be rebuilt by the same European countries over and over and over again, good money thrown after bad. To the extent that they've been doing this, third states, including the EU, the argument goes that you're actually reifying or crystallizing the illegal situation of Israel's territorial conquest by normalizing this situation through your developmental aid, which you say is meant to support the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, but which you're leaving left open to a bilateral political process between the raped and the rapist, being the Palestinians and the Israelis, right? How do you negotiate the end of your bondage, right? A perfectly legitimate, critical view. And it's because of that view that we brought the case at the ICJ in 2024, where we have a deadline for the end of the occupation, where states now politically are beginning to affirm that Israel is not sovereign in the territory, that they should not then throw good money after bad. Does that mean that they might not support Palestinians until such time as they're free? They should, they ought to. But when they do, they should take more principled positions and make it clear that by providing said support, they're doing so with the timelines involved, that Israel should withdraw, that this should be a Palestinian state, that they should couple their humanitarian support with political pressure on the Israelis. Otherwise, the humanitarian support and the tax dollars that are spent in Europe to do it will be all for naught. So policies can shift based on these principles, but your question is very important.
I think this was the last question. Is there any other question? Well, so I can close the session today. Thank you very much for being here, Professor Imseis. It has been a very insightful lecture, and you have seen that at least part of the Spanish young society is very, very interested in the Palestinian cause. And I hope they will keep like this.
Well,
thank you very much for being here in Spain.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Gracias a todos y ya sabéis que tenéis más sesiones y gracias por vuestra atención y participación.